Okay, everybody. Today's lecture is going to be over disaster, and with this, we're going to cover the emergency disaster preparedness part of our course. And so, this is just a brief presentation on disaster management, more so the incident command side of disaster management, and we're also going to cover a little bit about the initial triage. And being fire department, EMS services, we all come together and do this process pretty much together. So we'll start with disasters and the definition, or just a brief definition of what a disaster is. And basically, this is many people trying to do quickly what they do not ordinarily do in an event or an environment with which they are not familiar with. And a lot of times we are dealing with natural disasters such as tornadoes, hurricanes, earthquakes. These natural disasters tend to put us at a limited response, limited personnel. And so primarily in our state of Kentucky, we are dealing with natural disasters. And if we remember or look back several years ago at West Liberty, Kentucky, when the tornadoes come through and just did a lot of destruction to that small town, and they were quickly in need of a lot of help, and we were able to mobilize a lot of help, but it took time to get to them. Just the damage that was done to infrastructure and buildings made it a challenge, and gathering up our equipment, getting things ready and on the road during storms and tornadoes in other counties were also something that made it really challenging. So we'll start with principles of disaster management. And one is to prevent the occurrence. And although natural disasters may be difficult to prevent, there's some proactive measures that we can take. And one of those things is within, our planning. How we plan for it, what are we going to do, who's going to be involved in that, and the organization of equipment, personnel, staffing, and everything from communications to call out lists to the equipment itself that we might need, to mutual aid with one another. Minimizing the number of casualties, again, through prevention. And these days, especially when it comes to weather, you hear our weather people tell us to be weather aware, and a lot of folks nowadays have bought these weather radios for the NOAA system, and it warns us when impending bad weather or possible, damaging weather is coming through, to give us enough warning in order for people to advance to either safe places, whether that be basements of homes or out of mobile homes and in fire department buildings, secure buildings, storm shelters and things of that nature. So this is another way that we can minimize the number of casualties. We want to prevent further casualties as well. So as on the ground itself, the system and the triage systems that we use to sort injured people versus non-injured, the way we do this is very efficient. And for us, training in it, being proficient at sorting these folks by their airway, by their injury, by these certain things that we'll talk about, especially with start triage, we'll be able to be efficient enough to prevent further injury or further casualties, if you will. On our list also is rescue, and depending on what has transpired, rescue is always a challenge. First off, I'll tell you that there's no single rescue operation that goes the same every time. Even vehicle rescue, which is something that we do on a regular basis, these scenarios and scenes just don't go exactly the same every time. You're going to be presented with challenges that you're going to have to use critical thinking to work your way through it. And it's simply we're drawing on our experience. We may draw on other people's experience that's on the scene, and this could be a variety of folks. So rescue can be a difficult venture in itself. It's something that requires a lot of training, and in preparation for this, we have to spend a lot of time with rescue. Now, I'll say in today's world, fire department, when people think of fire departments, they don't just think of firefighters putting out fires. The general public nowadays realizes that the fire department in most cases is well equipped to take on a number of these rescue efforts, from trench to high angle to vehicle to farm rescue. These are all areas that fire departments are training in on a regular basis. And so the public is beginning to realize that our expertise is not just falling under fire, but is falling under a little bit of everything. And I think because that we show up on these scenes, especially emergency medical scenes, oftentimes firefighters and fire departments are the first responders on the scene. And so basically they're beating the ambulance service and other rescue qualified folks. So the public does realize what we're doing. We do want to provide for some first aid after rescue has been effected, and maybe even during those efforts, we step to providing the general first aid. It could be as simple as opening airways. It could be as simple as stopping bleeds. But these are the first efforts that we'll make on these scenes. And again, we have to realize that potentially we can see some pretty bad stuff when it comes to natural disaster. But you think about disasters that have occurred that fall under terrorism, and domestic terrorism is a prime example. We have had foreign attacks. Al Qaeda has attacked the United States several times, but we also think back to those moments of terrorism that have been done by people who are from and live here in the United States. The Oklahoma City bombing being a really large one that occurred and did a lot of devastation. So you think about, how would we rescue folks in that event? How's the incident command system going to work? Who are we going to call when we have something to that magnitude? We're going to evaluate the injured as we go along. We're going to use a triage method and an evaluation method to keep things simple, and then we're going to keep things efficient to where we can save the most that are savable, and prevent casualties the most that we can prevent as well. And then at some point someone will be providing definitive care ultimately until we get folks transported to where they need to go. And then there's going to come a time in the incident where we will help facilitate recovery operations and efforts, and maybe even into the reconstruction phase of things. And again, the fire department is wearing a lot of hats these days, and we will definitely be helping in recovery efforts from, if it was a natural disaster. You think back to Katrina as an example in New Orleans. I've visited New Orleans many times, and they're still trying to recover from that happened many years ago. They have greatly recovered, but there's still projects that are ongoing with the infrastructure, for an example, that they are still working on to restore or to prevent something like this happening again. One of the things they did early on through federal funding was to upgrade the levees, dams, and the pump systems. They have massive pump systems now that, yes, they can be overwhelmed, but not as quickly as what happened before. So they're still in that reconstruction phase. An acronym that we use sometimes, CFLOP, is what we'll go over next. And it kind of has to do with the incident management system. But we're going to talk about command. And first and foremost, what you have to do is establish command. Oftentimes, the mistake that we make is the first arriving units make a brief assessment, and then that doesn't get communicated over the radio to everybody else that's responding or potentially could be listening and could potentially respond. So somebody has to be in charge. Somebody has to take command and get that ball rolling first. Finance and administration falls in there. Money makes the world go around. That's true. And even in our rescue operations, there's a lot of paperwork and the financial side of things that eventually we're going to need to procure and begin to pay for things. All right. And so an example would be building collapse or a tornado where we have a lot of structures that have collapsed, partially collapsed, or been heavily damaged. And we're doing these search and rescues and collapse type rescues. We're going to need materials for shoring. And so when we quickly go to the local lumber yard and get that opened up and get this heavy timbers, at some point someone has to pay for that. Yes, they're going to let us have a line of credit and they're going to give us what we need to do the job, but at some point they have to get paid. And so again, with the administrative side of that part of finance, we have to track what we get. We have to track what we use. We have to paperwork wise, we got to track all of this so we know how much that we're going to owe in the end game. Logistics, being able to procure things and get things from point A to point B. You may have organized rescue teams that they're ready to go. They're just waiting on some of the equipment. So we have to have someone in charge of that to ensure that we get things moving from place to place for those folks that need it. And who do you call? If we need lumber, who's on our go list for lumber? If we need heavy equipment, who's on our go list for heavy equipment? And so with the administrative side, communicating that to logistics, boom, they're then going to start getting these things in motion. Operations is where the boots hit the ground, and this is where the meat of the work is being done. The operations, so you'll have somebody that's in charge of the operations side of things and what's broken down within that. And this is your different sectors where you may have rescue, you may have treatment, triage under an divided up into EMS branch, and then now you have triage, treatment, a makeshift morgue. You have these areas set up with transportation, and then somewhere in there a staging officer. So all of this falls under the operations plan. And then planning, especially when it comes to incidents that are going to be lengthy in duration, we're going to need additional planning for those operations. And so we need a section alone that's able to plan, that's able to procure, send things up the chain that we need just for the operations side. Under your management staff, you have, of course, your incident commander, who is overall in charge of everything. But we also have, and we've talked about this before in some different modules, but safety officer. Your safety officer is one of your key folks that's going to be over overall safety of the program. And we may have other safety officers, especially that may fall in the operations side, so on and so forth. But you do have one person that's over all those folks, and deciding on where they go and who they are, and sorting through the experience that's needed to do that job. Public information officer is a part of the management staff and is definitely a must. When big things happen, you're going to attract the news media, and you're going to attract them in groves. They're going to show up on scene, and they're going to start asking questions. So we need one appointed person that will be able to be over that part of the program. The public information officer will be able to um, speak to these people and give them the right information. The reason that this position is in the management staff, area with incident commander is the command staff is going to decide what information can be given out and what information cannot. This then gets uh, sent to the PIO, the public information officer, and then they deliver that content accordingly. Liaison is someone who can be a go-between between groups, and in the management staff there may be multiple groups operating. There could be groups, it could be fire department, EMS, police, all working in their separate, independent entities, but they have come together for this one disaster. And so if we need things from another group, such as equipment and or even personnel, we may need that one person that can go between and make the proper requests. Under operations, in this one, we're going to specifically talk about the EMS branch responsibilities, and that's going to bring us into some triage and talking about casualties. But realize under operations that you can have several branches. You could have fire department or the rescue branch, fire and EMS branch may be together if that's who runs it, or it could be separate. So realize that you can have different branches, and under each branch you may have a leader, heading up the show under each one of those branches. So we're going to talk about the EMS branch and the responsibilities there. Command of that branch, there's going to be somebody in charge, and we're going to appoint somebody that's going to be over extrication and somebody that's going to take care of triage. And the wonderful thing about triage and the way that we've set triage up is anybody in the system can triage. So we get into this where we have first responders, EMTs, and paramedics. So you have different levels of emergency first responders, all right? And paramedic being the highest in the field. And so what happens when the paramedics are not on scene yet, but you have, first responders that have boots on the ground and ready to go? Those folks can triage. We train them to triage, okay? Treatment and triage, again, under the extrication tab, and those that are involved in extrication, when we have people entrapped, we may need to triage those people, and then that will help us prioritize who we're removing first. Under the treatment sector, the treatment part, there again, we're going to have a triage and treatment. So we'll divide up, and those that aren't entrapped and undergoing extrication, and these are two things that quite possibly are going to be going on at one time. Transportation within the EMS branch, which means we're going to need a staging area and a staging officer. Most likely we'll have mutual aid with other EMS services, so we're going to have multiple ambulances on site, and we need a way to organize them by their ability, BLS, ALS, so on and so forth, critical care, and then we need a person in charge of sending the appropriate units when they're called for. This all will fall under the transportation, the transportation side of things under your EMS branch. So somebody's in charge of the branch. We've got extrication and treatment and triage all going on. Once those patients are removed and sorted, then we need a way to, after the initial treatments, we need a way to get them to the appropriate hospital. Now, one thing to note here is we have to realize especially when we have an overwhelming number of patients that we're dealing with, some of the problems that we may incur, and that is, who do we send to what hospital? So again, we have to make the decisions on the triage, based on the triage, based on the injuries, and then sending these folks to the immediate appropriate facility. Sometimes this may not be the closest. Sometimes it will, depending on what timeline we may be dealing with. And so the other side of this is, if we have, let's say for an example, we have 2-3 hospitals within the 20-mile radius of this scene, but we do have one that's fairly close, we may not be able to send every patient to the same hospital, because we would then in turn overwhelm them. And so again, we would base it on their capabilities, and also someone is going to have to be in communication with the area hospitals to find out what their capacity is, what they can handle, what type of patients that they can handle, so on and so forth. Again, we talked about the staging area a second ago, but we do need an area set up that we're going to stage the appropriate equipment. So we're talking about the EMS branch right now, that's ambulances and rescue units, but you may have in your staging area fire apparatus or fire units, rescue units. You may have EMS units, and even coroner's office as well, with multiple counties that are helping out with the death that may occur. Our supply chain is another area that we have to think about in our EMS branch, and we can quickly overwhelm the supply that's on all of our ambulances. Most folks keep a pretty good supply. As far as that's concerned, they're able to turn 4 and 5 medical and EMS and trauma related runs without, having to restock. But at that point, then they're going to have to restock supplies on the ambulances. So again, we need a way and a liaison to make sure that we know where we can get supply from, and then make that happen. Some departments and EMS services will keep pre-made or pre-packaged totes with bulk supplies for trauma, and injuries. So there'll be a bulk supply of splinting material and trauma pads and 4x4s and bandaging material. There'll be, bulk supplies of tourniquets, bulk supplies of chest seals, all these things, and they're kept in one spot, and they're kept packaged in bulk in like large totes to where they can be easily grabbed, loaded into a pickup truck, and boom, transported to the scene. So, but knowing who has those capabilities, where they're located, all of this will go back to the planning phase and the planning process of your incident command. Next, we're going to hit on triage. And our goal with triage is to do the best for the most with the least by the fewest. And it kind of sounds funny in a way, but that is our job. And by doing this, we are going to be really efficient at our job. We want to, again, do the greatest good for the greatest number of casualties. One of the methods that we use is the START method. It's called START triage. It's been widely taught for many years now. And so this is what the first thing we're going to talk about. And it stands for simple, triage, and rapid treatment. This is the acronym START. And it helps us remember, of course, you're starting triage, you are using a simple triage and rapid treatment method. And so this acronym helps us remember that. START looks for the simple signs of hypovolemia, respiratory distress, and altered mental status. It allows for a method for first responders to carry out simple hemorrhage control and airway protection measures. Triage is then ongoing and continues until all victims then have been cleared or removed from the scene. Your triage, folks that are doing triage and the folks that are in charge of triage must be medically responsible. Most trauma victims die in the first hour due to the inability to either ventilate, due to bleeding, or from central nervous system type injuries where the brain cannot maintain adequate breathing or adequate perfusion. Triage must be rapid, and it must be simple, easily taught, and easily remembered. So when we begin this process, we simply remove all ambulatory patients immediately. And this is as simple as we can say, we can shout out, if you can get up on your own and move to this area over here, we need you to do so now, immediately. And so those that are ambulatory and can move about at the time are going to move into a group, and then we'll be able to sort through them as a group. We're going to continue our start triage process. This should take less than 60 seconds per person. And we're going to ask the question, is ventilation adequate? Is perfusion adequate? And is the brain injured? This is the 3 questions in 60 seconds per person or less that we want this process to happen. C-spine's considerations take a back seat when we're dealing with large numbers of victims. This is something that has been taught for many years. We tend to forget about that and always want to, because it's been ingrained in our minds, C-spine, C-spine, C-spine. But in these situations, it kind of takes a back seat. We certainly would do it when we know we have a known injury, and if we don't do otherwise, we could do more damage. But again, if you're pressed for time, you're going to do what you got to do, and you're not going to worry that much about C-spine. So we want to check the airway and breathing. If our patient is not breathing, then we are going to open the airway. So if we're doing a head tilt, chin lift, jaw thrust, whatever we're doing, open the airway. If there's not breathing at this time, then at this point we will tag them non-salvageable and move on. If they do begin to breathe, after we have properly opened the airway, we are now going to tag them as immediate and continue our efforts. Next, we want to estimate the breathing effort. If less than 30, continue the assessment. If it is greater than 30, then we're going to tag them immediate. We'll assess the radial pulse or both the capillary refill. If the radial pulse is present or the capillary refill is less than 2 seconds, we'll continue our assessment. If there is no radial pulse or capillary refill is greater than 2 seconds, then we'll tag immediate. And just to recap, if you have a radial pulse present, your systolic blood pressure is at least 80 to sustain that. And so that kind of just gives you an idea of where they're standing on blood pressure without, having to take a cuff out and measure it. And then capillary refill less than 2 seconds tells us that right now their body is perfusing quite well. And so when you do a blanch test on the nail by depressing the fingernail or toenail, and you watch for when it would pinken back up real quick, then that should be less than 2 seconds is what we're saying. We may stop any bleeding at this time that we have recognized. And we may place in the Trendelenburg position, which is the feet up. Ask the victim to follow simple commands. So now we're thinking about the brain. If they can follow the commands, we tag them delayed. If they cannot follow commands, we would tag immediate. Pediatric and geriatric considerations. START does allow for triage of large amounts of victims. On your pediatrics, there's a little bit, it's called Jump Start. We don't go over Jump Start in this particular presentation, but it does have, it's a little bit different. You're measuring and looking at the same things, but the parameters are a little bit different. And then what we need to recognize in our elderly folks is the elderly folks don't compensate as well. And so they may, as far as blood pressure and shock, they may fall off the wagon, pretty quick. Kids or pediatrics compensate very well for a long time, even in trauma. And then when they drop off or they give you that first sign, it's usually not a good sign at all. It's usually happening. It'll happen very rapidly from that point on. So that's two considerations to keep in mind. The START triage allows for triage of large amounts of victims very quickly. As first responders, we do not need a lot of medical training to do it, but we do need people that are medically responsible. These patients need further definitive triage. And so most people are using a MET-tag system. And it's a tag, color-coded tag system that helps us sort patients out by color. And when we're going to go over the colors here. When we tag somebody dead, we use the black portion of the tag. This means that they're not breathing after the airway is then opened. At this point, we deem them, there's no pulse, no breathing after we open the airway, and we deem them non-salvageable at that time. Immediate is red. This is the need simple care given within minutes, such as sealing up a chest wound, inserting an airway, maybe performing a cricothyrotomy on them if they have crushed airway or problems with the airway, or maybe giving IV fluids as an example. These would all fall under the reds. Delayed is yellow. This is where simple care is given within hours, not minutes, but hours. And they would be, broken bones, unless it's a large bone, like the pelvis or the femur, then, like arm bones and you can go hours, if not days, with some of those injuries without treatment. The walking wounded or the minor or green. And these are the ones that probably got up and walked away when you first sorted them out. And when we further took a look, they have some minor injuries. It could be cuts, bruises, scrapes, things that can last, they can last a long while. So these are the things that can be delayed for hours to days. And again, that they don't fall under a priority of transport per se, like your reds and your yellows are going to. They have added a color over the years, a blue, which could be a black initially, or we tag them blue. And basically what we're saying when we black tag somebody, we're saying that they're not salvageable. They're already dead. Basically, there's no breathing, no circulation. And in the real world, if this was a single victim, then we would make efforts to work trauma cardiac arrest, and we would do some things such as give fluids or maybe chest decompressions or CPR certainly. But in the event that we have a large number of victims, if we focus all our efforts on one person that's already dead and we take away from the 5 down the road that we could treat, then there's a possibility that 2, 3, maybe all 5 of those people would die without our help. So we're saying that one person is not worth all of the effort that we're going to give the next 5 and probably save these next 5 people. So, but in the event that we have the help to do so, we have a lot of help. We have a lot of paramedics, EMTs, firefighters, police officers trained on the scene, and we can dedicate our efforts to that, or we end up not having as many critical victims as we thought, and we now have more folks, we may be able to tag them blue and move back to them quickly, using some efforts. And these are the people that are well on their way to dying in front of us, and we might be able to help them, but we still have to sort through the rest of our patients. So if a great number and no resources, we may tag them black at that point. But with the many resources that we have today and the mutual aid agreements that we have, we may find ourselves getting into blue tagging some folks.